everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Flipping the Barrel, a podcast where we interview energy leaders in this space to uncover and find out more about their career and life journeys. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Allyson Anderson-Book, who is a Chief Sustainability Officer at Baker Hughes. In this role, she oversees Baker Hughes' net zero strategy by driving sustainable operations, supporting commercial energy transition solutions for customers, and ensuring market creation of these solutions via stakeholder engagement and policy development. She has a ton of awards and is just such an influential woman in energy that we wanted to kind of highlight a little bit of everything that she's been nominated recently. She was recently honored by Hart Energy as an agent of change in energy for its 50th anniversary Hall of Fame series honoring industry pioneers, and was the only Chief Sustainability Officer to be listed among the top 10 energy leaders in the Americas. Allyson was also amongst the top 50 powerful women, Power 50, by National Diversity Council, honored at one of the largest diversity conferences in the US. In addition, she was recently recognized by the Petroleum Economist among the top 10 women leading energy transition and sustainability, and by Oil and Gas Investor as amongst the 25 influential women in energy. Holy Allyson, you are just such an incredible leader in this space. We are so honored to have you on the podcast today and to find out a little bit more about how you got to where you are today and kind of what has shaped you into becoming the leader that you are. So thank you for saying yes to Jamie and I, and for having you on the podcast today.
Well, it's my honor to be a part of this because you women are leading something and creating a whole environment to bring leaders together and learn from each other. And so that's an excellent thing to participate in. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Allyson. And I have to say, after hearing all your awards and just how much you have grown throughout the years, it's really incredible to think about where you started. You're from a small town in Iowa, and your parents actually divorced when you were pretty young, and then your mom remarried. I remember you mentioning that y'all were like the Brady Bunch family. You had a brother, 3 stepsisters. You were in a small farming community. But as you grew older, you realized that things weren't always as they seemed. And that was really interesting to hear from the perspective of, as we do get older, we do start to realize like who our family members really are, but also who the world is around us. Can you tell us a little bit about this experience and also how it's impacted you today in the way that you lead?
Yeah, at that time, so I guess a woman never gives up her age, but I will. I'm almost 50. And so if you do the math, so I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, okay? And back then, divorce was more normalized and things like that. And so my parents separated in different towns. And so through that process, you go and I got a little city life and a little farm life, right? And I will say, like, the experience of growing up in an environment on a farm where you've got a working, we're not the farmers, my dad was the caretaker. You got a sense for what it's like, okay, with maybe a little less of the responsibility, right? Whereas in the city, you get the full bodied experience there. The experience of being in that sort of family dynamic was powerful. My family's my family, and I love my stepsisters and my brother and my whole outrageously huge, gigantic family. And so, like, I have 2 aunts named Dottie. They're actually sisters. Okay, so that just speaks to like how crazy my family is that they even share the same name. But the experience, I will say, growing up was excellent, because even down to living on a farm where you take for granted that you have this whole ecosystem around you, that there are pitfalls, dangers at the same time, but also amazing experience that I wouldn't get any other way. Just the fact that you learn where your food comes from and humility from your earliest days.
So Allyson, you mentioned growing up in the 70s and 80s, and this was also something very particular of that era, in the sense that, you were a very reserved child. You initially even showed a little bit of like language development issues compared to your peers. You were quieter. And this kind of raised different concerns in your parents in how you were developing a little bit different than other kids. You also with a little bit of hearing issues and just attention. And I think it wasn't as common as it is now, where a lot of people share what's going on with their children, and, being a little bit slower in development doesn't really mean anything, because we have a lot more data and just showcasing that it's normal in a lot of kids to just take a little bit more time. But, in that time, maybe it wasn't as open to find out a little bit about that. But, your mom always kind of saw it in you that you were very talented, regardless of just kind of comparing you to your peers. And, you were in a gifted and kind of talented area, and you even did a test where it showcased that you were extremely good in math, science, and music. But there was a misconception just back then where because of social skills, you were labeled differently. Can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of what you've learned over the years, and maybe for parents who are struggling with something similar, and kind of how it's okay, and look at you now, right? Chief Sustainability Officer of a huge, Fortune 500 company. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, back then divorce is more common, but it was not common at all for people to be talking about different neurodiversity and things like that, like they do today, right? And so if you were to take today's paradigm and try to classify how I developed back then, I would be cast in a completely different way. I would be surprised that I got to where I did today, and so it started with, I had slow language, like that was no joke, very slow language development. And, but back then they just labeled you as they're kind of shy, right? I was very scared of lights and cameras. And every time a flash would go off, I'd cry. I mean, all of these things that might point you into one bucket today, back then were just idiosyncratic kinds of things. And so the turning point was really when they thought I was deaf in the classroom, and that was around the 4th grade. But I was in a big open floor plan school, so I've been very fortunate. Had I not gone to this specific school, I think I would never have ended up where I was today. I was in one of the public magnet schools in Iowa, and so at that time in the 80s, by then, Iowa was always in the top 3 public school programs in the United States. And and one of the ways that they excelled was identification of what they deemed were gifted kids. So in the process of them saying, well, she's not paying attention in school, like she didn't seem to hear us, right? Well, I went and had my ears tested, and as it turns out, they were a little bit blocked, but the reality was it was more in how my brain processes sound. And so I actually overhear sound, which means in a big environment like that, it would just shut my brain down. Okay. And so once they realized that I could actually hear so much all the time, they were able to kind of pull me aside. And that's where I started to do a whole lot better, right? It was understanding how someone experiences the world in a slightly different way. And so that was when I got put into a gifted program, and they had me come in to take the test. And from there, the next school I went to, I picked a gifted program. And I was able to like completely turn around, and the engagement in school just kind of skyrocketed. So, but today I might not have had that sort of outcome, right?
Yeah, I just find it so interesting because there's so many different ways to develop, and kids all have different attributes that change as they grow older. How do you, from that experience, what do you think was the most impactful for today on how you lead? Because knowing how everybody's different on your team, and how specific people might be more sensitive to other topics, you being in this and having this journey, did it kind of affect the way today as you talk and you build those relationships with others?
Most definitely. I mean, the one part of this is like, by not having really gone up with like a particular label about how I think and such, aside from being in a gifted program, which at that time they had originally called it TAG, but they didn't like that it was a label. And so they changed it to gifted and talented. I'm thinking it's just a name. So why does that matter? But they really, like, I'm very cognizant of the fact that people don't necessarily always want to be in a certain category, right? We're all individuals, and everybody's got a voice, and everybody needs to be heard in some way. And so what I take away from it is sometimes you can get the best ideas from the most reluctant speakers. Okay, maybe the people who talk the softest versus yelling at you all the time, so to speak, because the world always seems to be yelling at us, doesn't it? The pace of things is so fast today. I mean, the other aspect is that, sometimes when people are perceived to be slow, or they're just not getting it, I don't understand. I've explained it 4 times. Like, why don't they understand it? I want to give you guys a great example that I've seen even in my team about a year or so, a couple of years ago. Like, I have this a team that's in multiple different countries, like so many of the bigger companies do. And we've got this heavy US contingent, and then we've got a lot of Europeans on the team. And so what I've noticed is the Europeans tend to speak many languages. Okay, so they got a leg up on us because, like, do all of us speak all of languages? No. I can only rudimentarily sign right now because I'm back in sign language. But but I really admire my European colleagues because they can usually speak 2 to 10 languages, right? There was a woman on the team who people were perceiving they really liked her, but they thought that she was really slow to pick up content. Maybe she wasn't so sharp. And I said, well, have you tried to speak to her in Italian? And then everyone was like, well, I don't know Italian. I'm like, huh, isn't that funny? Because she knows English. So maybe you should think about the fact that English is her second language when you didn't bother to pick up a second one in Italian. Okay. And once they realize that, like, they carried their bias with them, and that in fact she wasn't struggling, but that she was an extraordinary person who speaks so many languages, right? Then they became a little bit more compassionate to say, aha, okay, so I need to think about how to better understand what they're saying because she's accommodating me and trying to learn from me, right? And so it's this noticing the differences really does matter because we all have a different, I guess, live experience is the way to say it.
Yeah, I really like that you shared that because as you start managing more bigger and bigger teams, to your point, just everyone learns differently. Everyone has a different time frame. People like communication in different styles. Some people want a one-on-one, some people want an email, some people want a text message, especially now with the younger generation. And so it's just kind of figuring out how to deliver that message and kind of understand that everybody's different. Something we wanted to talk about, which is very personal, and it's a big tragic event that happened in your life that you were so open to share with us. And so thank you, because I think a lot of people who could relate to this would be very thankful that you're sharing this. When you were in university, your father tragically took his own life. And at that time, you became very depressed. Your grades started to suffer, and you started to not do well in school and even received your first C grade, which was, of course, very normal, in my opinion, for a student to kind of go down that negative path after such a tragic event happens. So it's very normal. But at the same time, the people around you who are like, hey, you're an A student, you're a gifted, talented student, like you cannot give up, this regardless of like what's happening around you. And you even had a teacher that really kind of like with tough love came and like approached you and said, like, you have to kind of take ownership and you're gifted and you cannot let kind of all of this ruin your future because you have a bright future. But, can you tell us a little bit about kind of that perspective of kind of how you changed your life in that moment when you decided to kind of take ownership and to move on with your life? Because when something like that happens, I can understand why a lot of people just don't want to move on,
Yeah. For me, so that grade was actually a D, which was like very heartbreaking. Okay? So it was an epic fail. When my dad passed away, it was sudden and unexpected, right? And so what happens with people in moments like that is like we all grieve somewhat differently. And you've got a couple of roads that you can choose because grief manifests in so many different ways. And for me, because I had been a pretty top tier student for a long time, I could pretty much coast and do okay. I was a little bit of that sort of bubble around me, and then I could keep coasting and things like that. But in this case, I had an instructor who cared enough to speak to my advisor who followed me, knowing that I was, for the detail that wasn't in there was I had a full ride scholarship for math and science. And so he wouldn't accept the fact that I would phone it in when it was so important that I turned that around. And at one point he actually said, like, do you really think, I know what happened with your dad. Do you really think he would be proud of this moment? And the answer was unequivocally no. He would have like he would have taken me to woodshed for D. Okay. But what came out of it was I think I had 5 minutes where I thought, I want to really be mad at this guy, Dr. Cross. I still remember him. He's a very influential guy in my life. And I wanted to be mad because everybody likes to have somebody to blame. But the only person who could be blamed in this moment was me, because I gotten too wrapped up in feeling sad and bad about what happened and blaming myself. I mean, number one for people to take away is when a person ends their life, that person makes the choice. There's no externality that will help that person undo what they've done. Okay. And so the faster people in the grieving process can reconcile that it was that person's choice, then the faster they get to heal, right? And I
Mhm.
think in that moment, I realized how kind of self-indulgent a little bit that I had been, and sort of trying to blame myself, trying to blame this, blame that. And it was cold water in the face. And after about me thinking like, you could have just given me the C minus and I wouldn't have to take this over again. The knock-on effects. So anyone listening, you can realize this wasn't just like a bad grade, right? If I didn't take calculus again for being a math and science person, I would lose my entire 4-year scholarship. Okay. But because I had to take it again, it added a 5th year of undergraduate for me. And so, man, did I pay that back. Okay. And so I had to take out in my 5th year loans to cover that last additional year, because when you're out of sequence in the math and science progression, you get held back, right? And so it was deeply personal. It was the bulk reason why I ended up taking out just a little bit of school loans. And from that moment forward, I realized like I'm in control of my fate. I make the choices. I don't want to ever sit back and phone it in again. Like you got one life. I mean, if I learned nothing from my dad taking his, I learned life is precious.
Wow, Allyson, I'm so thankful that you shared that. And I think even listening to you speak about it again just reminds me of just how somebody like yourself, looking at where you're at today, nobody would probably ever imagine that happened to you. Nobody would have ever imagined that at that age, at that time in college, you could not even be where you're sitting today if that teacher wouldn't have even stepped out and said that. So I think it's just so important. And what's even more astonishing is you ended up graduating with 2 degrees, geology and music, and you always actually saw yourself performing on stage as a musician. So I always found that very interesting about you. But you ended up taking a job with ExxonMobil, which kind of throws this whole story for a loop, because I really didn't, listening to how you grew up and what you were interested in, the oil and gas industry didn't really seem like something in your path. Can you tell us about what made you take on ExxonMobil as your first job, and really what you learned about the energy industry at that time? And did you have any perceived ideas of what the energy industry was when you started?
Yeah, I went to school initially for music, and the fact that I got the science and math part was icing on the cake. But when I was in the music program, actually, I was exposed to so much overt sexism and discriminatory practices, outright harassment. I mean, very serious, without getting into that, because that's a whole other thing. But the Me Too movement coming out of the entertainment industry, like that's very real. So don't think for a moment that people playing in an orchestra don't have that as well, because if you look at an orchestra today, you almost never see a woman on stage that's in the bass section, right? So that really, after spending the first part of my life, actually, I started playing professionally when I was about 13. It turned me off so heroically. But one thing turns off and another thing turns on. And so I loved the earth science department. And so a big part of the pivot was my advisor saying, I know that you're having a hard time. If you just come to my class every day, you're going to get through everything. This is like after my dad died. And so that started it. Okay. So this guy, his name is Jim Walters, and he's an amazing guy. And he really believed in me. And then I get through my school and I go to my master's program in geology. Okay. And then I go in for a PhD. And when I was at Kansas, my then instructor, so I never really had female mentors, it's worth noting, but I always had these great male role models who really believed in me and what I could do. And so when I first started undergraduate, I would say, there's no way, oil and gas, those guys are evil. Okay. I mean, that was legitimately what I thought. But it didn't stop me from actually, there was a flyer up in the student room in my school, and it had the $5 cost for an AAPG membership. So the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. And I actually joined way back then. Okay. So I think I joined like the year that I graduated, I could join, and I've been a member ever since. Right. And so that was the first moment I thought, they're not so evil that I won't join it for $5. Okay.
Yeah.
So then flash forward, here's how it went down between me and my PhD advisor. His name is Lynn. And Lynn said, Allyson, I really want you, the oil and gas companies are coming through here. I want you to go apply. And I said, but I don't want to work there. I'm always been very candid. Lynn, no. And he said, Allyson, yes. Like, I am your advisor. You're going to go and you're going to practice interview for a summer internship. And I said, well, like, do I follow my sword here? Like, do I die on this hill? And he's like, you have to do this. And I said, okay, I'll do this. And so I interviewed, and Exxon gave me an internship. What was notable in the interview was that the person interviewing me was more interested in my music degree than my geoscience degree. He said, it's very clear to me that you've got a great brain for geoscience and math. And he said, but what I've discovered is that musicians make some of the best geologists. And so that was how I ended up pivoting over into that, because he gave me a chance. And then I went and worked in geophysics for a little bit there. They gave me an offer, and the rest is history. And what I discovered in the moment going into Exxon was, in the course of a summer internship, I did as much deep scientific work over 3 months than I did in a 2-year master's program. And that blew my mind. I got to work with some pretty renowned sequence stratigraphy gods, right? Peter Vail is one that I thought, like, I read all this stuff. That's what I went to school for. I'm gonna work on this. And there he was. And so that was pretty exciting. I mean, what's not like to like about that? I get to do incredible science at Exxon.
I like that you shared that, because, a lot of people sometimes, when they don't know much about the oil and gas industry, or even joining an energy company, they don't think how much science, technology, research, just PhD folks, et cetera, that goes into powering the world. And so I think it's really nice, if you are into STEM or science, or that's something you're passionate about, oil and gas companies are looking for that kind of talent. And so I really like that you mentioned that, especially in that summer, being able to do almost what you did in 2 years of a master's. One thing that was really interesting, and I think that can help a lot of women who are listening to the podcast specifically, is, after you were at Exxon for a few years, you spent 11 years in Washington working in the public sector. So kind of left that, kind of energy company, and then went to work in Washington. And then your husband pushed you into joining Baker Hughes. So I want to know the story, because it's a good story of kind of how you found out about this role. But I think the question that I have here is that kind of imposter syndrome. And I know a lot of people don't like that word, but just that confidence gap of, okay, I've been gone for X amount of years in Washington. I'm working in a completely, even though it was still energy and certain things, just in a different world. It wasn't like your corporate America type of role. And then all of a sudden, you're going to apply to be vice president of energy transition at Baker Hughes. And so can you tell us a little bit, because I think a lot of women, sometimes they want to make that change. They've got what it takes to be a VP or just kind of get a promotion elsewhere, but there's something holding us back of like, I'm not in that area. What would people think? I don't think I would ever get the job. And then you mentioned your husband really pushed you and like encouraged you. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of the role that he played in your career path at this point?
Yeah. So he and I met at some point when I was in public service. Okay. And anyone who knows me know that my reliable memory for time is not very good. Okay. I'm good at one thing, but I'm not so good at that. So at some point when I was living in DC, he and I started dating and got married. You'd think I'd know it. Our 10-year anniversary is next year. Okay. And so one thing I would say is, at numerous times, right? So he probably met me when I was on the Hill, and then I was going to work in the administration, and there's an interview process. And he's like, oh yeah, you should do this. He's always been very encouraging in that regard. And so at some steps, when it was a more incremental step, it wasn't such a stretch for me mentally to think, oh yeah, I can be doing this, right? Then from there, I went and ran a nonprofit. It was when I was in a nonprofit, which is the nonprofit that I got the opportunity to leave Exxon and go to the Hill with. Okay. It was that group. And I was at a contract renewal point, actually. So I had only a couple days left to decide, do I stay or do I pursue something else, right? And I was about to sign renewal, and a recruiter from Exxon for Baker Hughes called, and she sent me the job description. And I looked at it and I was like, I don't even know what this means. That's what I thought when I saw it. Like, what's this mean? Okay, you know how corporate speak is. Sometimes it's
yeah.
Words, and you're like, what words do I even pull out? So
there's like 50 bullet points of like all the things that you need to do or have done.
Yes. And so I remember I was like, what does this mean? And so my husband said, like, just go get the thing and let's talk about it. And he looks at it, and my husband is a very gifted writer. He is a very crazy intelligent guy. And he takes one look at it and he's like, this is your entire career in a job description. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I don't even understand it. All right. He's like, no, let's break it down. And so like he'll probably watch this and be like, I really didn't do that much, but he did. He walked through point by point with me and said, it's seriously your whole work history summed up in this moment that it's your dream job.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that he knew that before I knew that, because like that's partnership, right? When you've got two people that know each other well enough to know an opportunity when it's hitting you in the face. Okay. But it was his encouragement, we can all talk about marriages given and take, but in moments like those, having the confidence to back the other person up is pretty amazing, right? As women, maybe some of us, there's that old data point that goes around where it's something like women apply for jobs when they're 100% sure that they meet all the criteria, whereas men apply when they think they have 60. Whether or not that's true, there is something to be said about women regularly not sort of seeing themselves in roles. And I was on a panel years ago before this happened, actually. So it's kind of funny that this I didn't believe in myself even then at that point. A woman asked me on a career panel, what's the single greatest thing that held you back in your career? It's the same answer, myself and self-doubt. And so every time where I thought, I don't really know, it's been that moment of like, I'm not sure that I have quite enough experience, right? And I'm now at that point, though, you get closer to 50, you're feeling a little bit more secure. And so now I have come to realize there's almost nothing that I can't do if I don't work hard enough and surround myself by amazing people.
I love that, Allyson. And what I love is that you talk about like the confidence part, because I feel like that's what a lot of women do miss, is that confidence that's needed to at least just apply. And, this kind of brings me to the next question, which is around, you as a leader, you're in a position that create change. How you approach your team and how you approach building your team is really important. And I know that specifically you look beyond just diversity of color and gender, but you're very specific on neurodiverse, especially since you experienced that growing up. But there's two parts to this question. I want you to talk a little bit about that and why that's so important to you and kind of how your life experiences had impacted that. And second, I want to talk about the time where you realized that when you were reflecting on a position that you had actually created, that you realized that there was a lot of biases in that role, that in like the way that you defined it, very similar to how your husband was like, no, this job description, this is you. You realize, wow, there's biases I didn't even realize were there. And it's not really offering the flexibility for even women to apply. It sounds like something that they're going to have no time for family if they take this job. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that experience has kind of changed the way that you do write your job descriptions, but more importantly, how companies can look at the way that they write and the way that things are read can really impact who can even apply and how people think about that role?
Sure. Starting with so my team today is, and you should know, every part of my career, the thing that gets me to take a job, aside from my husband, no, because I had my own free will. Is when I see the opportunity to make change for the better, and with every role, it's got to have greater and greater impact, right? So some would say, but working on the Hill, you had great impact to a degree, So as I go along, it gets bigger and bigger, and so now I'm at a point where when you look at the fact that currently at Baker Hughes we've got about 58,000 employees. And from, over, 190 to 200 countries, right? Think about that diversity in that mix. And that's the diversity we know about. And, to do big change kinds of projects, you've got to have really innovative ways of thinking about things. And you've got to not have people who all think the same. Okay. And so regardless of whether it was in my role when I was at the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, so that was after Deepwater Horizon happened, where we had to think how do we take a traditional regulatory role and make it something else, right? How do we ensure that safety still happens without being cost crippling? Those are big, hard things to do, and you've got to be innovative. And so what I tap into when I can is that neurodiverse part of the population. It's the hidden diversity that you don't see that gets you people who think slightly differently. The most dangerous thing a leader can do is surround them by people like themselves, because then it's an echo chamber and you test ideas against like a mirror. Okay, that's not good. And so you want to actually have people that will say, well, wait just a second, that doesn't make any sense to me, or how about we try it this way? And so the team that I've got today, partially it came by accidentally that through the sort of decoupling bias from job roles, that I ended up getting such a very sort of how we think is so radically different from each other. I mean, it's a really fun and unique team in this regard. So I was trying to build the team, and I had a core group of fairly sort of conventional folks who had been in the company for a while. And no, they're all but one are still here because that guy retired. Everybody else is still on the team because every perspective is good, okay, and needed. But when I put in the first couple of roles, we got almost no applicants. All right, which that was weird because energy transition was really picking up in 2019. And people were like, "Oh, what is this?" Maybe they were just confused, like I was, about the language. And so I ended up I was scratching my head. I called the head of recruiting, who's a great friend of mine, Graham, and he said, "Hey, Allyson, I got something for you. You're really like mentally flexible. Can we do some pilots with your team?" Sure. So we tried this thing called Role Mapper, and now Role Mapper is more available, and I think we use it predominantly across the company. I was just one of the very first pilot people. So the actual CEO of the company sat down with me and walked me through this algorithm that looks at positions that you're going to put out, and it flags bias. So I learned a lot about myself, okay, as did several of my folks who were hiring people. And what I learned was that I had a bias towards science degrees, okay, and towards men. And that was shocking, okay? And it wasn't like one of those biases that you consciously think about. Obviously, his bias isn't really like that. But it was related to the fact that I had been brought up a certain way where you put out positions in a certain description, and they must all have degrees, and they must all have this, and this. That bias that I introduced was because I didn't stop to think, how would I recruit for women differently than men? One size does not fit all. Okay. So that was immensely powerful for me because I was too rigid. And I never thought about myself that way because I could think, yes, they have to be in the office. Yes, they have to do this. It turns out I had 4 out of the 5 classic traps for what keep women out of the workplace in my job descriptions. And so the moment that we put it out, I took off the degree requirement. It was work from everywhere. You can work your own flex hours. We went from having about 20, 25 people that applied to we capped it at 500 after 2 weeks. I mean, it was like game changing when we took the bias. And so if you're seeing as hiring people that you aren't getting the interest that you want, you should realize that you probably introduced the bias. Okay, there's something that you're doing that's keeping people from applying. And just day and night. I mean, we took the exact same roles, old and the new, so many applicants. And today we swung so hard at having gender balance, and now we have like 70% are women. When I first started out, I had like one female and 6 guys or something. And so very, very different today. But behind it all, an additional thing that we made sure that we don't introduce bias on is in that bias around how we think. And so we have a deliberate partnership with a group called Potential to make sure that we can bring in different kinds of thinking. And that's resulted in doing some truly innovative work on emissions. If we had not had this diversity, we would not be nearly as far as where we're at in terms of our carbon reduction journey today. It's pretty amazing. And I've got an immensely talented team to thank for it.
It's incredible to think, because I think like even just like a job posting, you wouldn't think so much into it of like, I'm being unconscious or I'm trying to hire men only. And to your point, you were very surprised, but it's incredible just kind of all of the things you kind of have to look into now to try to attract more of that diversity and kind of change the, quote unquote, old ways of doing things. Because to your point, I think that's how job postings have been for years. It's always like
Yeah.
the same copy paste for years. And so I love that you guys are, doing something different, and you're seeing the results yourself from 20 something to
Totally.
500 plus applicants. It's
Yeah.
amazing. So kind of on that topic of bringing more women to the workplace and more diversity, et cetera, you are now at the C-suite level. There's very few women still, about 20% or less, and probably in the energy industry, I think it's probably lower. What do you think are those things that now, as you're getting closer to 50, you've got tons of experience and just you've talking to multiple women and men throughout the years, what is one thing that you've observed on the sidelines of, what's hindering women's progress or what's holding women back? Is it still the unconscious bias? Is it, family, that they're having kids? Like, what do you think over the years that you've been kind of able to gather, or even for yourself too, that you're like, oh, this is, I've overcome this, but I can see why it's holding a lot of other women back. Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, on a personal level, I maintain it's been me only that really holds me back. Early in my career, it was other people, all right, because there was so much bias. I mean, like, I've actually been told girls are bad at math. I'm like, but I'm a math scholar.
Yeah.
Like, okay, not the list of that guy. Okay. So,
Yeah.
like, whatever. And now today, though, like, I struggle with a calculated tip because that part of my brain has struggled along as I've gotten older. But I would say part of it's bias is like people just it's not like there's malintent most of the time. Okay. It's more about people don't know what they don't know. And it's hard to like really take a look in oneself and say, I've introduced this bias or not. So bias is part of it. And then there's a social norm that happens in certain parts of different sectors. Like let's look at by the numbers. If you're to look at gender, okay, HR unequivocally, male or women, men or women,
Women.
Yeah.
Okay, finance, men or women,
Men.
it's mostly
Women.
men still, but
Men.
there's some
Yeah.
women. Okay,
There is some women. I started thinking about some of our finance people. I'm like, wait, actually,
Yeah.
but majority of men too. I feel like that one of their first things is like business or finance that they major in.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so now let's take HSC. Oh, now it's getting more complicated. You got a little bit of both in there, right?
Yeah.
Now let's go to sustainability outside of our company. Actually, now inside the company, women. Okay, so now the pendulum has swung. So when I first got started, it was all men, and then so we go out and we try to tackle that, and we get so good at recruiting women. Now I have a hard time actually finding male candidates, right? And so anytime you're looking at things like the gender split, breaking the glass ceiling, the glass ceiling part is a little tougher to get at because from where I'm at, the times were so different back then, right? And so that early in career, I would be held back on gender, okay? And not overtly, it was usually in the bias. I still know by the time that I got to running the American Geoscience Institute, I know that I made approximately 26% less than my predecessor, which is actually the average, 26% less in pay. Okay. That's shocking, right? And so why is that? Well, I ask, like, why am I making so much less? Well, you're 20 years younger. Okay. But didn't I come here with the same experience level as the last guy? Yes. But I got it 20 years earlier. And that was where the person that I was talking to was stumped. And I was like, right, well, you didn't finish the PhD. And I said, yes, but I still got all the schooling. I taught in university. And again, I still got to where I did. Does that not hold the same merit? They were stumped. Okay. So what holds people back, I'd say, is a lot of that perception. Again, it gets back to bias. And then sometimes themselves, like you can see, I've learned how to ask the hard questions and challenge a little bit more along the way. I'll give you one more thing to think about. When I was working on the Hill, there's like no structure there. Okay, like, there's a structure of the actual government itself, but like the Senate offices and the House offices, there's like only a couple of jobs you can have. All right, and so I was on a committee, and so you could be senior professional staff, or you're basically assistants. And that's like not counsel. Like if you're a lawyer, you get to call yourself counsel. And I came in as a professional staff, which means, was everyone else unprofessional? I don't know, but professional stuff. Okay. So I went in one day and I was about to quit because I got a great job offer and I was going to take it. And I had hinted at this for quite some time to my boss, who I love. And he's a wonderful man. His name is Bob. And we keep in touch. You should know this. And I said, hey, Bob, I got this job. I'm going to go. And he's like, what? He acted so surprised by it. And I said, well, we talked about this. And like when I left the oil and gas sector, my salary went like this. And it's exactly this. Okay. So that's like math. Okay. Let's get back to math. And I'm paraphrasing it. It took me a lot to have the courage to have this conversation. And he said, okay, I recognize that. You're right. I could do more. Can we negotiate? Can I come back to you? Can you give me a few days? And so we had this back and forth. He came back in about a week and he said, I can give you this number if you'll stay. And he said, is that final offer? I said, I'd like 5 more. I'll give you 5 more. Okay, so we have the back and forth. Yeah. And then at the end of the negotiation, he said, you're the first woman in 15 years of me working in my job to ever ask for a raise.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I hate hearing that. That is terrible.
Yes. Can you believe that? Oh my God. And so I just sat there. It's like, no way. And he said, yeah, you're the first woman to ever ask me for a raise. And he said, I'm really proud of you for doing that. And I'm like, I've been so fortunate to have great male mentors and supervisors who look out for me just like my husband does, even when I might have doubted myself. Right.
Allyson, I'm so glad you shared that. I mean, that's one thing that Massiel and I are very passionate about. And we help a lot of women on that subject, and it's asking. You don't get it unless you ask. The worst thing that's going to happen is they say no, but the best thing that's going to happen is
I mean, you'd be surprised at how much you could actually negotiate, even if it's a little bit, even if it's like 1 or 3%, but just do it. Because guys are doing it all the time. So
yeah, so we gotta have a voice, right? Not hold ourselves back, and thankfully he did that. And I should note, because he's just such a great human being, he said, if I can, before you leave us for the actual job you'll take next, I'd like to continue to give you more and more equitable pay. And when I ended, he more than made my salary whole from when I took the pay cut to work for him in the first place. And so he honored his part of it. So I'd say the corollary is work for really good people.
Yes. Allyson, I love your podcast. I love speaking with you. We could probably talk for another hour. I think you're just absolutely incredible. And what I really find inspiring about your whole story is you had so many moments in your life that could have really been something that you could have looked at as a reason to why you shouldn't keep going, or a excuse for why you haven't, passed that class, or why you just need to quit school. Or there were so many things that could have held you back that you overcame. And looking at where you're at today, I bet that little girl in Iowa was not thinking that she would be, chief sustainability officer of a Fortune 500 company. And that is what I just absolutely love about sharing stories like yours. And also just the opportunities that the energy industry provides. It's so vast, and you're a great example of that. And so just thank you so much for coming on the podcast and being so open and sharing some of those hard moments with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'd say one last parting shot before we leave. You guys are moms. Okay. So never forget the power of parenting, because while I said I never had a female mentor, that's not entirely true. My mom was the single greatest inspiration in my life. And if I hadn't had such a strong and sort of, quiet but powerful woman as a role model, I definitely wouldn't have gotten through everything. And so as you guys raise your gals, raise your amazing youngsters, remember the power that you have to actually grow the next generation of leaders. It's pretty fantastic. And thanks for having me on your podcast.
Well, thank you, Allyson.
Beautiful way to end. Almost getting us emotional here.
I'm
because you're so right. I know. I'm like, hold the tears.
And ironically, my mom was just calling me as you were saying that. In your voicemail.
Well, you can give her a really good hug at the end. Then give her a voice hug. Anyway,
yes. Thank you, Allyson. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe, leave us a comment, email us. And we just love to hear from y'all. And thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you.